Right, now that we have a nice code for a keylogger that works perfectly, let's extend this code and polish it more to have a good program that we actually can use in a real life scenario. So the first bad thing that we have in our code is this number right here, which is the interval that is triggering our report function. So if we set this to a minute, the report function will be executed every minute. If we set this to an hour, the report function will be executed for every hour. So it'll be nice if we actually use a variable in here instead of hard coding it like this in the code. Now, using the way that we initially wrote the program, we would have had to use a constant or a variable here at the top. In our case, since we have a better implementation right now, we can actually use an attribute in the constructor in here. Now, like I said, you can think of a constructor just like any other method. The only difference is it gets executed automatically when the object is created. So this, just like any other method, can take an input, an argument, and we're going to make it take the interval, and we're going to say self.interval is equal to the time interval. So basically what we're saying is, now when someone wants to create my object, when they want to use my keylogger class, they have to pass a variable, or they have to pass a value in here. So for example, let's set this value to 4 this time. And this value, the value that we're passing in here, is going to be stored in an attribute called interval. And then I'll be able to access this attribute throughout my class. So this is a very common way of allowing the attributes to be set when the object is created. So now, when we want to use this value, all we have to do is just type self.interval, and now my report function or my report method will be triggered depending on the time that is passed to us when the object is created. So in here we're passing number 4. This will create a new object. It's going to get the time interval in here as 4. This will set self.interval as 4. And then we can access self.interval throughout the program, and its value is always going to be 4 unless we modify it in our code. Now the next thing that I want to add in this lecture is, instead of the print in here, like I said, you can either write the logs to a file or send them to an email or to a server. Now, I think sending it to an email is more practical because that'll allow us to use the keylogger as a remote keylogger and send it to our target, and then the keylogger will send us reports of every key strike entered by our target to our email for every interval that we set when we create the object. So, instead of just printing in here, I'm actually going to get the sendMail function that we programmed before. I'm gonna copy it and paste it in my keylogger as a method. So I'm just gonna minimize these two and minimize this as well. And I'm just gonna paste it in here. And obviously, like we said, because this is now a method, not a function, the first argument has to be self. Now, I'm gonna minimize this as well because we don't care about how this works. We wrote it, we know it works, and we forget about it. All we have to do is call it in here instead of printing the logs on screen. So we're going to call self.sendMail. And as you know, this method takes an email, a password, and the message to send. Now the message to send is easy. That's going to be the self.log. So it's exactly what we're printing in here. But we don't know the email and the password. And again, if we are writing this program using the initial program that we wrote, the one that did not use a class, we would have had to create variables in here, call them username and password, and then use them in our method, which is not a good way of doing it. A better way is what we're going to do right now, which we're going to take more arguments in our initializer or in our constructor. And the first one is going to be the email, and the second one is going to be the password. And then we're going to store these values into attributes by saying self.email is equal to the email that we're going to get as an input. And we're going to say self.password is going to be equal to the password that we get as an input. So again, it's something similar to what we're doing with the interval. And then when I'm calling my sendMail, I'm going to give it the self.email and the self.password as the username and password. And finally, I'm going to give it the message to send, which is the self.log. I'm going to remove this print statement, and we are good to go. The only thing is we need to modify the way we're creating the object now. First of all, we have to give it the interval, and I'm setting it now to 4. So this is going to be for every 4 seconds, we're going to get an email with the logs that the person entered. This is not good because it's a very short period of time. There will not be a lot of text written using the keyboard, and we're going to get too many emails on our email. Instead, I'm going to set this to 120 seconds, which means every 2 minutes, I want you to send me reports to my email of what the user has entered. Now, in a real life scenario, you want to set this to an even larger number, but 2 minutes is good for now. We also need to pass the username and the password because, as you can see here now, the initializer takes the time interval, takes an email, and takes a password. So I need to give it the username and password, and because I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy them from here and I'm going to paste them, and now our program is ready to be used. Now I'm going to go down and I'm going to run my program. Oh, and we're getting an error because I forgot to import the smtplib, which is a library that is used in our sendMail method in here. So I'm just going to do import smtplib. And also I want to modify one thing. Before sending the log, I'm actually going to append 2/n's. So 2 new line characters before we send it. And the reason for this is sometimes when the log is sent as is, and if it doesn't contain any new line characters before it, it'll all be included in the subject of the message. So it'll still work, but the text is going to be sent in the subject. When I do this, we're going to skip the headers and it'll be placed inside the content of the message. Another thing is, when creating the log, the first thing that I'm going to set this to, I'm going to set it to keylogger started. So the first time the report method is sent, it's actually going to be something like a notification telling us that the keylogger has started on the system. So I'm going to save this and run it again, and this is working, so that's perfect. And if we go down, here we go, you can see that we got an email straight away telling us that the keylogger has started. So we know we're on track and we should be receiving logs from our user every 2 minutes. So let's, for example, go to a website like facebook.com. I spelled that really badly. Then I'm going to put a username, and let's call it, for example, zaid@facebook.com, and put a password, which is 123 zaid123. And notice that this website is being served over HTTPS. So it's being served over the latest security measurements or standards that's known for now. So this should have been reported, and everything that I'm going to type in my keyboard is going to be reported regardless of what type of security is used on this application, because we're literally recording everything that's entered on the keyboard. We're not really hacking any security that's implemented on the server side or using an application that's being used by the user. Now I'm gonna pause this video so that you don't have to wait for the full 2 minutes until I get the report, and I'll resume once we actually get the report on my email. And here you go, we got an email, and if we click on this email, you can see all the key strikes that were entered. This is when I was trying to type Facebook and I typed it really badly. Then this is when I typed it properly. I hit enter, I put the username Zaid, and then I typed shift to type the @ character, and then it's at facebook.com, and I press tab to go to the password field, and I put my password, which is 123Zaid123. So as you can see, the keylogger is working perfectly. It's sending the reports on my email, and the code that's used to do that is actually a really good code that uses object-oriented programming. We can set the interval, the username, and the password using variables, and we don't really need to worry about how the keylogger works. All we have to do is literally import the keylogger and start it. So this is a very modular way of doing it. It even allows us to use it with other programs. Now, I know what you're thinking. Right now, our program consists of 2 files, the zlogger and the actual keylogger class. So how are you going to target a person and send them 2 files and convince them to run them? Not only that, but also these files are .py, so they'll only work if the system has a Python interpreter, which we know Windows does not come with one, and it has to be manually installed. Now, my answer to this is the same as what I've been saying for now, which is don't worry about this. We'll talk about this when we get to packaging, and you'll see how we can combine this into one executable and make that look like any other executable, or like an image or a PDF or any other file type.